Hey Bluefire Poker, this is Dustin Schmidt, also known as Leatherass. In today's video we're going to be continuing the Leatherass on Poker series. This is part 3 of a 4-part series. In part 1 we went over category A here, you have other options. In part 2 we focused on overbetting, range merging, Mississippi bluffing, examples of all those, as well as free money plays, or plays that are highly effective that work a substantial percentage of the time. I call them free money plays, but it's pretty close to that, pretty close to accurate. In today's video we're going to be just moving through a couple examples of what I call making plays when your opponent's hand is sort of face up or their range is capped. And then we'll be moving along through some big decisions, just some big pots I played. Some were deep stacked, some were just 100 big blinds, but they were all pretty much all-in type pots where you had to make a big river decision. So in today's video we're going to, like I said, move through about we're going to move through the 3 examples I have for when their hand is face up and their range is capped, and then move through a few of these hands under the category of big decisions. And then in part 4 we'll finish up the rest of the hands in the big decisions category. These require pretty lengthy explanations because they're hands that go 3 streets, and so as a result won't be able to get through a ton of those hands quickly. So we'll have to expand to part 4 to go through those hands. So anyway, with that in mind, we will go ahead and roll the hands out and start discussing. Alright, so here in the first hand, I have ace-queen suited in the small blind. Player 3 raises, player 4 calls, gets folded around. I go ahead and flat with ace-queen suited in the small blind, which I think is pretty much the only reasonable play there in that spot. And get a flop, not too great for us. I mean, we have a backdoor flush draw and 2 overs, but with 3 players in the pot, nothing to get too excited about at this point. I start off by checking. Player 2 is kind of the fish at the table, checks, and it ends up getting all the way checked around. So at this point, I kind of put player 4. He flatted a under the gun raise, which is generally pretty strong. And I don't really think at this point he would ever check, pocket 9s, pocket 10s plus. And player 3, I think, is going to be, maybe on a similar 2 big overcard, suited overcard type holdings, or maybe some type of medium pair like 5s or 6s or something that, wasn't too thrilled betting that flop into multiple people. But these two players' ranges should be fairly tight as they open. Pretty much, only pretty quality hands there from that position. So the ace comes on the turn, and obviously, one big concern is that someone can have ace-king here. Player 3 or player 4, certainly ace-king can definitely be in their range, but it doesn't have to be, and worse aces can be in their range. I'm sure a lot of them would open like an ace-jack suited or ace-10 suited or something like that. So I go ahead and just start by leading. I can get away pretty easily if anyone raises me, and so I think that's the play there, is just to go ahead and lead out. And player 2 calls, and player 4 actually overcalls. So I would think maybe the worst hand player 4 could have is something like ace-jack suited here at this point, but could very easily have ace-king and not want to raise ace-king because the board isn't too super scary, and the player would probably not expect to get action from a worse hand if he were to raise. And also, me leading into 3 people on this board, I think, I can definitely have some, pretty nutted type hands, or at least nutted given the action type hands. So after getting called twice, I don't really know if player 4 has ace-jack suited type of hand or ace-king. And player 2, I'm pretty sure, is going to have a worse hand than me, almost always, unless he has a hand like ace-3 suited. This is a fishy player, and I'm pretty sure he'd raise 2 pair on the turn without without a doubt with those stacks, and so not really worried about him unless he made ace-3. And so I went for just sort of like a weak, like, let's just try to get to showdown, slash, get player 2 to call with any ace in his range. I mean, at this point it seems like it is reasonable to expect everyone has an ace here in this spot, so it looks like maybe the case ace rolled out on the turn. I got a little ahead of myself here. As you can see, player 4 decides to min-raise. And so now I'm kind of ruling out ace-jack. I mean, he could maybe make like a small value raise with ace-queen, because ace-queen is sort of the nuts here in his mind. I mean, I can't really have ace-king, he wouldn't think, or at least not too often. And player 2, I don't think he's too worried about him in that case just calling 28 butts. Would certainly shove all in if he had 2-pair plus. So I put player 4 pretty much 100% of the time on ace-queen, ace-king here. His hands definitely pretty much face up in my mind, and his range is, pretty well capped. So, an argument could be made certainly for just calling this and hoping to chop with ace-queen. And, I think that's certainly reasonable. But on the other hand, even though I don't think I really play a hand for value like this where I would go ahead and re-raise back, but I do think that against most opponents, or I should say against most nittier opponents, I can get them to fold with a substantial re-raise here in this spot. I feel like there's sort of two types of opponents here in this spot. Like if I re-raise them, they're just like going to be confused and then always call. And then there's a lot of opponents who get confused and always fold. There's generally not a whole lot in between. I think if you kind of ask yourself that question, which type of player you are, when something kind of doesn't make sense, are you the type that always calls or always folds? And since this player was somewhat nitty, I thought that he would be maybe more along the type that would be confused and always fold. And so I went ahead here and, well, it looks like the hand history froze up. I'll get that right back going. Alright, so I got it going here. And so I decided to make it 245. I didn't necessarily think it was... I thought it was important to make a substantial raise back. I didn't think it was necessarily important to go all in to get him off that hand. So I went ahead and made it 245 here, basically just trying to either get him off the chop or get him to fold a better hand here in this spot. I really don't think I'm going to actually be good here, but I could maybe chop, like I said, against ace-queen. But I was hoping he'd be the type of opponent that would always fold here when confused. And so anyway, as we go through the hand here, my opponent did end up folding the river, and I think it's important to kind of ask yourself that question. First of all, which type you are, and secondly, which type you think your opponent is, because you can definitely find some spots throughout your session each day, I'd imagine, where your opponent's range is face up or capped or both, and make these types of plays against those opponents that sort of have that always fold mentality. And obviously if you overdo it with them, then they're going to start to skew towards the always call mentality against you. But I think when tossed in from time to time, it can be effective. Alright, so moving on to the next hand here. This is just a 1-2 example, but as I've said a bunch of times on my videos, merge network, you play against the same guys at 1-2 and 10-20 pretty often, so stakes don't really matter a whole lot. So starts off, I min-raise the button here with Queen 5 suited. Flop goes check-check, and I could definitely make an argument for betting because we're deep stacked, and my opponent doesn't, even though this would be a board oftentimes that would hit my opponent's range pretty hard with a lot of his suited connectors and sort of broadways, and they kind of all have like gut shots or something that was going to peel for this price. But at the same time, I think that deep stacked, my opponent's range can just be a lot of really random hands, like any 2 suited, could be like a 3-7 suited type of hand, or It can just be a lot of stuff as stacks get deeper and I'm just min raising. So there are a lot of hands I can get to fold here, and I certainly wouldn't have minded had I bet this flop either. But I definitely think checking back is certainly fine, because sometimes you don't necessarily always want to just end the hand right away. Sometimes interesting opportunities can kind of develop. So I decided to check back, and the jack comes on the turn. And so I definitely feel like betting here is sort of standard. I can, he might be checking to just give up, and I've got equity when called, almost always. So, and definitely decent equity against the range of hands that could call me here. So I don't really have, I don't really think there's any other choice. I'm always going to be betting the turn in this case. I get called again, and the river's an ace, and so I'm kind of whatever about it, but I think betting the river is fine. I mean, I'm giving myself a pretty good price. I mean, I'm not repping a whole ton. I mean, I can definitely have hands like ace 10 that might play it this way. I can definitely have hands like, or even ace 9, and then of course I can have something like king queen. Probably not really ever 8-7. I'm sure I would bet that on the flop, but I can definitely have king queen and play it this way. So I am repping some hands. Maybe even ace 4 I could have. So and like king jack, I'm sure I would bet here. Probably queen jack as well. Like any jack with any queen jack, king jack. So anyway, I think it's worthwhile to take a stab here. And I guess I could also have a hand like queen 8. Queen 8 I might check back the flop too. And then my opponent decides to go ahead and check raise me here, and makes it fairly decent sized, almost 4x. So I think from time to time he can be turning some hand into a bluff here. Maybe like a queen 10 or something that decide to turn themselves into a bluff, or a 10-8 type of hand. And that would be a reasonable play, I think, from my opponent, and I wouldn't hate him for that. Or I wouldn't hate that line anyway. But in thinking about this hand so much, I mean, he can definitely also be fairly strong, like have something like an ace jack himself or an ace 10 himself. Maybe even like a weirdly played pocket 4s, pocket 9s type of hand. But the main thing is my opponent can really never have the nuts here, because there's absolutely no way that my opponent in like something like a $15 pot on the turn with 500 behind is ever going to just check call king queen on the flop. I just don't think that's really ever going to happen. They're going to want to try and get some money in the pot, given the strength of their holding and the deepness of the stacks. So it's their only way to win a big pot is to put some action, either by leading or check raising the turn. And since I can have king queen and he can't, I think that this is a good spot, considering I think he's going to have some hands that he's just going to be turning into a bluff, and he also can never be nutted. I think this is a really great opportunity to go ahead and re-raise. And so I made the raise something like 156.73. And later on in the hand, about 2 seconds later, my opponent actually folded and showed pocket 9s, which I thought was an interesting line, certainly, that he took. I'm not a huge fan of it, and I can't necessarily fault him too much for the river fold either, given that I can have queen 8s and king queens, and he really can't. And obviously I did re-raise a check raise on the river, so his 9s are basically the same as like ace 2 on that board, where he's just sort of catching a bluff. I don't think I'm ever gonna turn like I'm just basically he just has a bluff catcher with 9s is what I'm trying to say. So anyway, when your opponent's hand is sort of face up, when their range is capped, again, good spot to kind of keep your eyes peeled for some options. Alright, so on the last hand of this brief, when their hand is face up or range is capped portion of this series, I go ahead and 3-bet an ace-king offsuit against sort of a fish here. Just basically just trying to get it in for value against a weak opponent. I get flatted by a solid regular here, player 1. And I think basically his range here in this spot is mostly always like ace king, aces, and well, basically like tens plus, and well, I mean, I guess I don't think it's ever going to be like a medium pocket pair, because he has to have some hand that can call player 6 if he were to shove and then I folded. So I don't think he's ever really going to have like 5s or 6s or anything like that. Something like that could potentially be in his range if maybe we were slightly deeper stacked and player 6 was more full stacked, but I think in this case it's going to be tens plus and ace king pretty much 100% of the time. So if we look at that range, we're doing pretty okay. We're obviously beating tens through queens, and we're chopping with ace king and losing to aces. And losing to kings too as well. But there's obviously you'd have to have the only other 2 kings here in that spot, which seems pretty unlikely. So I just go ahead and start by leading, because I feel like that's just going to make the playability of everything a lot easier, and I wouldn't mind maybe trying to get a little bit of value out of jacks, queens, tens with a diamond, and all that good stuff. So I lead out, which I think is pretty standard here in this spot, and I get called. And the turn's at 5 of diamonds, so while that looks like a pretty ugly card for me, I mean, my hand is not good now at this point, but at the same time, if we pretty much have a very good understanding of our opponent's range, and I think the rest of the hand doesn't necessarily become a math problem, but math can sort of help us determine what to do here. So if we think he can peel with pocket tens, pocket jacks, pocket queens with a diamond, I don't think he's going to peel with any of those hands without a diamond. So let's throw those hands in there. And let's say he would peel with any ace king, diamond or no diamond, and any aces, diamond or no diamond. But it's definitely possible that ace king with the ace of diamonds and aces with the ace of diamonds would raise this flop. It's not certainly mandatory from this opponent, but it's certainly reasonable to think that some percentage of the time he's going to raise those hands on this flop. So I think we can definitely discount him having the ace of diamonds to some degree. So what we're sort of left with is tens, jacks, and queens with a diamond, and ace king off without a diamond. And then occasionally aces with a diamond. Or, let's say 50-50. If he had the ace of diamonds, he would raise it, and 50% of the time he wouldn't. So bottom line is not a whole lot of ace of diamonds here in his range. So I felt like in this spot it would be a good spot to kind of do this and just lead out for basically a quarter pot bet. And player 1 goes ahead and flats again. Now, basically what I'm trying to do with this is, one is to get my opponent to put a little bit more money in the pot with like a tens, jacks, queens with a diamond before he folds. And secondly is also to kind of get some information. I feel like I don't think it's necessarily mandatory if they did have the ace of diamonds to raise there on the turn, but I think it kind of goes back to the first on the flop, where some percentage of the time they may choose, especially that bet size, to go ahead and raise the turn with the ace of diamonds, even if it was just some sort of mini raise. So I'm basically trying to get my opponent to put a little bit more money in the pot where their hand can really never improve, like with a hand like jacks or queens, or tens with the 10 of diamonds, and also to just kind of not necessarily get their hand face up, because they don't have to raise the ace of diamonds, but kind of somewhat get it face up. And so I led there for just 40 and kind of left. I probably should have led more for like 50 maybe, I don't know, setting up something like around a pot size bet on the river, which is not mandatory to like size your bets to like leave a pot size river when you're bluffing, but in this case it sort of worked out that way because I wanted to do the super weak lead on the turn, and quarter pot seemed about as good a sizing as any. And so I just really think that my opponent is not nutted here very often, and that I'm only occasionally chopping and almost always losing versus the hands he can have. Now the 4 of diamonds basically a complete brick for sure. Not going to change anything on the board. And so the only thing that would have sort of changed things on the river, I guess, is the board paired, although not that much because, unless he had basically kings and decided to flat and then on the flop and then flatted the turn because, now he just has a complete bluff catcher with his 3 of a kind. The board pairing wouldn't make a big difference in this hand. So basically almost all rivers were going to be bricks. And so I decided to go ahead and, the plan on the turn was to basically set up the shove on the river. And so I did shove the river and figured that I could, with that line, get him to fold anything that wasn't the nuts a really high percentage of the time. And I think I think utilizing bet size in that case was kind of what won me the pot. It was basically just kind of, like I said, getting my opponent's range as face up as I possibly could in this situation, and then just trying to exploit that from there. Alright, so now we're on to my favorite part of this series. We're going to start it anyway, is the big decisions category of Leatherass on poker. So this will be the last part, the last half or so of part 3 and the rest of part 4. So we'll roll the hand here. So player 2 opens. I decide to flat with 10-8 suited, which I think is whatever. I don't love it, hate it, anything. Player 6 goes ahead and squeezes, which I thought would be, I just wasn't sure what to make of his range here in this spot, but I knew that that we were deep and I was in position, and I had a playable hand, and I don't mind calling here at all with a little over 200 big blinds to start, about 210 or 215 or so. The flop comes obviously ace jack 8 with 2 diamonds, so I have bottom pair. Not a whole lot to work with. Probably was just going to fold if bet into for a large size. But my opponent decided to sort of weak lead here on the flop. He bets 44 into 110. And I think it's just going to be pretty darn rare that my opponent's going to make that sort of bet size with a strong hand, like a strong made hand like ace jack or eights, which I don't think he has eights too often there because that's not really a squeezing type hand in that spot very often for people, but certainly ace jack could be as well as aces and jacks. And obviously like ace king, ace queen, maybe figuring that they just want to make some smaller bets and get called down by a worse ace or get floated a couple of times by some gut shots or something like that. But anyway, I don't think much of his range in terms of him having a monster. I suppose it's in some people's ranges to sort of weak lead some monsters, but generally they're going to weak lead some big monsters on some boards that are less coordinated than this one. Like if it was like ace 7 deuce rainbow and he had pocket aces here, that might be a good spot for him to check or weak lead. But I didn't really see him ever having a monster here in his range with this spot. So I decided to go ahead and flat here to start things, and then sort of proceed from there based on whatever information he sort of gives me on the turn, and what the turn is and all that stuff. And the fact that I have an 8 here matters a little because it gives me a smidge of equity, and I can pick up a lot of cards on the turn that give me additional equity, like just like some more gut shots or something like that, but not anything too great. But obviously an 8 would be good, especially since I don't really ever have him on aces and jacks, and I could potentially win a really big pot against ace queen, ace king, if I were to, basically hit one of the 2 8s, or maybe even a 10, especially if it's not a diamond, could be a really good card for me. So after flatting, my opponent goes ahead and weak leads again. So now at this point, I mean, I really think his range is going to be something like it just looks a lot like ace, some kind of weak ace, maybe like an ace queen, ace king with a diamond. Obviously it'd have to be the queen or king of diamonds. It looks maybe like something like a king jack offsuit with the king of diamonds. It looks something like a king 10 offsuit with the king of diamonds. I don't think he's ever really going to weak lead a flush. If he had some sort of flush draw on the flop and then made the flush, I just don't really see that happening. And I don't really think he's going to weak lead to induce a raise. I think he's just weak leading because he has a weak hand, basically. So, and considering I can, somewhat well rep a hand as good as pocket 8s, pocket jacks, although not too often is he going to give me credit for that. But I can certainly represent any flush. And so, and then also it kind of doesn't matter what I'm representing. Like if he does have a hand like king 10, he's just not going to like call me down for 2 buy-ins, with king high or anything like that. Like if I continue to put in the aggression. So sometimes it's like people get so concerned, well, what am I really repping here? It's like, well, what does it matter if he has nothing either? So, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've gotten called with, a hand like king high on a 200 big blind pot when I was making a move. So I think in this spot, it's a good opportunity for me to kind of interpret his bet size for what it is, and which is probably a weak hand. So I popped it to 288 on the turn, and after a lot of thought, he decided to call. And my plan was basically to shove any non-diamond or non-ace river. Even though ace queen offsuit with like the queen of diamonds or ace king offsuit with the king of diamonds is essentially the same hand whether an ace came on the river or a offsuit 2 came on the river. It's basically just a bluff catcher because I'm representing a flush on the turn there. But I don't like to try and get people to fold for basically 60% pot in a big pot on the river with 3 of a kind of aces. I just don't think that that's something I find success in too often. I might shove against a very good hand reader, especially if they weren't expecting me to have very many moves here in this spot. I might expect them to find a fold there with ace queen, ace king off with the queen or king of diamonds, knowing that their hand is basically the same as like a pair of jacks there in that spot. But I don't really expect a lot of people to do that. So this was basically the only river I was going to give up on, and I still did think about it for some time, like, gosh, maybe if I had absolutely nothing, like if I had like 10-9, I might consider still bluffing and hoping that there's enough like king queens, king 10s with the king of diamonds, queen 10s with the queen of diamonds, or something like that in his range that maybe he would fold, plus maybe he would realize sometimes that 3 aces is still just a bluff catcher, and I could maybe for this price find a shove on the river. But with a pair of 8s and me still beating all the like gut shots and flush draws, that made it a very clear check behind here for me, and I was fortunate enough to check back and my opponent showed king queen off. So I think my read was pretty spot on here in this. And it obviously feels pretty good in a lot of ways to be like, hey, as the hand played out, I was just value raising the whole time, or I was just value raising the turn, no big deal. But oftentimes, as you really dive deep into a hand,
you'll find a lot of these opportunities. And sometimes against his range, shoot, it probably was a little bit of a value raise on the turn, because if I think his range is like gut shots with a good diamond, or ace queen, ace king off with a diamond, then I am sort of pretty much almost a decent percentage of time raising there for value. But obviously I wasn't really excited to like raise it for value though. While I was playing the hand. But anyway, with that, we'll move on to the next hand. All right, so this hand will definitely require a pretty decent amount of explanation. It was one of my favorite hands of probably the week that I played a couple weeks ago. I was really kind of happy with my read here and all this in this whole situation. It was definitely one of the most unorthodox hands I think I've ever played, online anyway, for these stack sizes. So it starts off, I go ahead and flat here, ace-8 suited. And actually, before I go on much further, I need to give a little background on the opponents, because that's basically the main deal going on in this hand. So player 6 is a complete ape. I mean, this guy, he's gone through several buy-ins. I really don't think he even understands what beats what. I mean, he's so awful. And he's been buying in full, and it's been great. And looks like player 1 has been, with the money seat on him, has been the guy that's been basically taking most of his buy-ins. So I wasn't able to get much of it, unfortunately, but he was definitely spewing off chips. Had sort of this random read on him where he would love to just go all in with you. He could make it 18 and you would shove, and he'd call you with like 6-7 of diamonds or something. But it'd have to be kind of like a fun hand like that for him. Like if it was like a ace jack or a king queen, he liked to kind of just call. It was kind of weird. And then if he had like a really big hand, he'd also like shove on you, and you guys might play a big pot, like with ace king, aces, kings, queens, those types of hands, jacks. So and he would like re-raise in this spot most always. If he had like 6-7 of diamonds, he'd probably just shove it here, and in which case, if player 4 didn't want to call, I would happily call here with ace-8 suited. So in this case, he decided to just flat. So I kind of had him on like that, king 10, queen jack, king queen type of hand, maybe like ace jack occasionally. He also, his only bet size was to pot it, which is definitely relevant in this hand. So anyway, we get a pretty decent flop here for my hand, and definitely a flop I'm really excited about against player 6. Given what he could do. And also, another bit of background, he'd shove sometimes with no equity, too. So, like, if it goes check, 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 and everyone looks weak, he might take, like, 5-6 of clubs here and just shove it. So, yeah, he was a beaut. So, player 2 checks, player 4 checks, I decide to check, and player 6 does not pot it or go all in. So at this stage in the hand, my hand strength is pretty good, but not spectacular. Player 2 can still kind of have anything decent, I think, because he did call here, and him checking the flop is probably what he's going to do no matter what he has. But probably not a great hand because he didn't squeeze. I'm sure he would, make a big raise if he had a basically almost any better ace, or maybe not any better ace, but certainly like a ace jack, ace queen, ace king, because he was pretty aggressive with his 3-betting and all that stuff. And this player 2 was a bad player as well, really bad too. So I'm still concerned about player 4 here. I know I have player 6 beat 100%. I know I have player 2 beat 95%. Player 4, he could very easily be checking, especially on the flop with like a really good hand that's just waiting for player 6 to like put all his money in, and maybe player 2 calls with like some king, and then he can have fun with everybody else with his really strong holding like kings or sevens or ace king or ace queen or something like that. So the turn comes with 4. Player 2 decides to check. Player 4 checks again. I decide to check because I just don't think player 6 is passing on anything he has. Like, he'll bluff anything he has now, and then if he has, any kind of like somewhat made hand, he'll probably just pot it too, because that's what he does. So I'm not entirely ruling out player 4 having a pretty big hand for the same reasons that I'm sitting here with a pretty good hand myself and still haven't put in any action. But I think it's becoming less likely because player 4 may not want to just continue to slow play. Although with an offsuit 4 on the turn, that might have helped him want to slow play a little bit more. Maybe if it was like a 10 of spades or something, he would want to start protecting an ace king or something like that. But I guess it's still possible he can have a pretty darn strong hand, given that it was just an offsuit 4, and the fact that player 6 could very often just shove in anything he has here in the spot. So I checked again, and player 6 reliably pots it. Player 2 calls, and then player 4 calls the pot bet. So now I'm sitting here with ace 8 going, oh my god, like, what's going on here? And I kind of hit the time bank, and I'm like, okay, let's think about this. Player 6 can have anything. Player 2 can definitely have worse, and probably does have worse. Player 4 is basically the only one I think I'm really concerned about at this point. Player 4 calling here, and especially overcalling 2 opponents, has to have something, of course. Is it better than ace 8? Well, decent chance, I think. I mean, it could be a worse ace, maybe. He opens like an ace 4 suited and would call player 6 to be shoved. Ace 3, ace 2, ace 5, ace 6. But that's, not a ton of hands. I don't think he would overcall with just a king. So, and he did open first act. So, I'm kind of starting to think a better ace is probably pretty likely. Maybe like an ace 10 or ace jack or ace queen. So I thought this was an opportunity when it goes pot, call pot, overcall pot to look pretty darn strong by making a raise, but really I'm just trying to get player 4 off the best hand and get player 2 and player 6, who I'm pretty sure I have beat, to basically, like I said, get the best hand out of the pot and play against the inferior hands. So I decide to go ahead, and it looked like it stuck again, so I'll get that right back. Alright, so I got it back here. So I decided to make it 232.50 here. I'm not really sure how I settled on that bet size, but I didn't want to overcommit myself in case player 4 was just trapping with some, ridiculous monster like a set or something. And I didn't really think he would like call for 230 but not for 290 or anything like that. And I get player 2 kind of close to all in, or him, probably just shoving if he's going to do anything, just because his chips will almost always be in, or almost already be in. And player 6 I am putting all in here. So player 6 called. Oh, we're stuck again. I'll get it right back. Alright, so we're back here. Apologize, this hand replayer can kind of be fickle from time to time. So I made it 232. Then player 6 called, and player 2 called, and player 4 did fold. So I'm going, okay, well, I hope my read was right on player 2. I wasn't scared at all of player 6 calling, but when player 2 called, I'm like, oh boy, what I get myself into. Player 2 checks the river, and I decide there's not really much value in betting the river against him, since he may have a better ace, or he may have just been calling with some draw, getting a good price, and I'm not going to get any value out of that hand anyway. So I go ahead and take the showdown, and shown 5-6 and king queen here. Player 4 later typed in FML. So I'm pretty sure he might have had like ace jack, ace queen, or something like that. And just figured that I maybe wasn't on that thought process of trying to squeeze the better hand out of the pot, or just maybe had some big monster like pocket fours or something. But anyway, he gave me credit obviously for a better hand there in that spot, and that was one of my, that's one hand where I feel like if I was playing live, I would spot something like that a pretty fair percentage of the time. But unfortunately, I think I miss too many of those opportunities playing online. 12, 14 tabling, and obviously it helps when you're live and you can get some physical reads and stuff like that. But anyway, it was kind of fun to have a hand like that occur online, and anyway, I thought it'd be a fun hand to show. All right, so in this hand, this was kind of a fun situation here. It starts off innocently enough here. Player 2 calls. Player 4 was sort of a fish in this pot. I decided to just player 2 min raises the button. I choose to just flat here from the small blind. Not really a hand that I think I want to 3-bet in this spot when I can hopefully get player 4 to overcall with a pretty big portion of his range. And the flop comes, pretty good for me here. I've got an open-ended straight draw. I've got sort of the nut open-ended straight draw as well. It's ace-8, and which means I beat all the like king-8s, queen-8s, jack-8s. Obviously not 10-8s, and 8-6s, 8-7s, 8-5s, but there might be some 8-4s, 8-3s, 8-2s in his range if they're suited. And player 2 was opening like 65% from the button, so there are 8-4, 8-3, 8-2 suiteds in his range, certainly. So, in this spot, I decided to go for a check raise here in this spot. I checked and, basically 3x or almost 3x'd his check raise. And this is not a board. I mean, I guess if he re-raised back, I would probably just shove, because this opponent can definitely re-raise back with some complete air, because I do check raise a lot here, and this opponent's really aggressive and is definitely not afraid to kind of click it back, or make it 110 and still be folding, like you might do with like an ace-2 off or something, and then fold if shoved on, because basically unless I have like a set or 9-7 or something, I'm not going to be too thrilled about getting re-raised back, and so that can definitely be part of his thought process here in this spot. So I am check raising to potentially shove if he re-raises me back. So he decides to just call, and the turn's not gin, but one of the best cards I think that can come. It now gives me an open-ended straight and flush, open-ended straight draw as well as a flush draw, and not to be discounted, an ace, which is not going to give me the complete nuts given the action, but if it goes like ace of clubs on the river, and I'm pretty darn sure I'm going to be having the best hand really high percentage of the time. So lots of outs here in this spot. So I go ahead and lead for 72. And I probably would just go ahead and call if he shoved there in that spot, because I think he can have occasionally like a Jack 10 of spades or something like that might do that. And it's just so hard for me to ever really be in bad shape given the draw that I have. So I would bet and sort of like reluctantly call the river, or excuse me, the turn. But at this point, I think he can definitely have like all over pairs. He can have, like a, any random 9, maybe like a 7-8 type of hand. There are other hands too, but I think you guys get the point. Like some type of like pair and a draw, or maybe like an ace-9 or something like that. So I go ahead and lead, and the river's a 3, and I thought, and I just really didn't think, given our dynamic, he was really ever gonna fold a pair here. Especially if it was like some hand like 9-8 or 7-8, because he's kind of, or 6-8, because he's kind of blocking, some of the value combos I can have. And my check raising range here in this spot could be like, it could be pretty darn wide. It can be like, king, jack, like of clubs, diamonds, or spades. Something with like 2 overcards and 2 back doors. Definitely a hand like jack 10 of spades, diamond, clubs. Some hand like I have. Not really going to have a whole lot of 8s that aren't ace 8, I don't think. Because, I guess for a min raise I could maybe have like a jack 8 suited or something, given player 4 is a fish. That kind of expands the number of suited connectors I can have. And of course 8-7 too. I can't have 8-7 as part of like my standard either 3-betting or flatting against a min raise from the button range. So I just didn't really feel like I had a lot of fold equity. So I really thought check decide was sort of the play here. And so I went ahead and checked, and the opponent just instantly shoved all in. And, I really don't see him slow playing a set or 2 pair very often. I guess he could have something like, maybe something like top set he might slow play a little more often, or maybe like aces or kings or something he might play this way. But, when he goes all in like that, it's really starting to look to me a lot more like, he's double floating me with some like overcards and gut shot, like jack 10 of clubs, or maybe definitely jack 10 of spades on the turn. And then he can have all the 8x, and a lot of he can't have any ace x suiteds that pick up flush draws, of course, because I have the 8 of spades, so he can't have like, jack 8 of spades or anything like that. But he can definitely still have all the 8s, I believe, in his range. And, with the overbet here, I've got ace high. It would have been a little bit more of a consideration for me to shove the river, because I feel like he might fold 9 sometimes, or like some, pretty strong made hand. I said earlier, I didn't think he was going to fold very often, or often enough. But if we combine all the random 8s that he would have to fold, maybe some of the double floated jack 10s, and occasionally a decent made hand, then it could maybe argue for me shoving all in on the river, or making a pretty big bet on the river, at least like 2/3 of pot. But considering I had ace high, I sort of had like the nut 8 in this spot, so I didn't really think that I needed a shove. I really thought that check decide was better, because I do sort of bluff catch everything he has, and he's like never going to turn like 7-8 into a bluff here in this spot. I think he's going to take the showdown always, or even like 6-8. So gave it some thought and figured I was probably going to be good plenty often, especially given that kind of overbet shove deal he's doing here. I actually don't mind doing this if he happened to have like 10s plus here in this spot. I think that's going to be a really good bet size to make, and a bet size I make all the time in that spot, because I want to look bluffy, and a lot of times I'll get looked up by like that 7-8 or 9-8 type of hand from my opponent. So anyway, I didn't think necessarily he would do that though in that spot. So I went ahead and decided to call the river after some thought, and was fortunate enough for him to show up with jack 8. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up part 3. I hope you guys enjoyed these hands. We've got some bigger hands here, or excuse me, some more hands from the big decisions category, and some other really fun ones to talk about. So anyway, a lot of these are sort of like non-standard hands that come up, but I like to go into all these things, and it's basically just the idea of encouraging the development of your thought process more and more, and that's kind of where I'm aiming with these types of videos, because I think like table play videos are really good because so many of the standard situations come up, and you can kind of really develop like the base, a good baseline for your game. But I think these are the types of videos and these kind of like weird hands where we can sort of talk about ranges and how to, kind of how to defend or react or exploit, etc. Ranges and just kind of being in goofy spots kind of really helps you hand read a lot better. And so I like to talk about those types of things, since I know a lot of you have got a good baseline for your game and are trying to expand your thought process. So anyway, with that in mind, we'll end the video now. I hope you enjoy it. Please know that you can get in the forums and ask me anything about these videos. So until next time, we will see you, and I hope you guys stay tuned for part 4.